This video was requested. It's kind of a prequel to my Knitting 101 basic knitting stitches. And someone had asked if I would talk a little bit about how to hold the knitting needles, how to hold the yarn, how to tension the yarn. And I thought I would give you a little bit of information first about the needles. I do have a video. I will put a link up in the corner. If you click that little eye, it will take you to the history of knitting and knitting needles, and it will give you a little bit more information than what I'm going to share just briefly. But we'll start with the oldest needles that were used, and that is, surprisingly enough, the double-pointed needles. These are the oldest. Knitting did not start out originally as knitting flat. It was knitted, everything was knitted circularly, and they used double-pointed needles. Now, double-pointed needles today are used mostly for small circular items like hats and socks, fingerless mitts, things that are a small circular design. That's what we would use double-pointed needles for today. And the way they are used is they usually come in a pack of 5, and you take your work, and if you had 20 stitches, you would disperse the 20 stitches, 5 stitches on each of the 4 needles, and they would form kind of a square that you would have them spread out all the way around on the 4 knitting needles. It's a little awkward to show without having the yarn actually on it, but they would be kind of like this. And then you use the 5th needle, and you actually work across a needle at a time, and you rotate your way around. So you always have 4 needles with stitches on them and 1 needle that's actually doing the knitting. So that's just a little bit of brief information about double-pointed needles. The next knitting needle is the one that most people are more familiar with, and that is the straight knitting needle. So right there. This is a smaller one, just so I could fit it on the screen. And you usually have 2 of these, and this is what your traditional knitting needle is that most people think about. A lot of people don't use these anymore, and the reason being, if you're knitting something that's small, you're fine. But if you're knitting something like a baby blanket or an afghan or a sweater, to use something like this can put a strain on your wrist, because when you're holding the knitting needle, all of the weight from the yarn is on this portion of the needle. So it puts a strain on your wrist and it can give you tendinitis very easily. So I tend to use circular needles. These needles some people use, but you don't see them used as often as you used to. Circular needles seem to be the most common. Circular needles came out in the early 1900s. There's different types of circular needles. There are fixed circular needles, which is what this is. In other words, this is the cable or cord, and it's permanently attached to the needle. There are also interchangeable needles, which is one of these, where the cable can actually detach by either a lock or, in this case, it just unscrews. So I can change the length of the cable, or I can change the needle size just by attaching a different needle or a longer cord. So these are interchangeable needles. Now, even though these are circular needles, you don't need to knit circular things on them. The cords can come in different lengths. This one is a 9-inch needle. As you can see, it's really small. I actually use this for fingerless mitts, and I use these for socks. Instead of using the double-pointed needles, you can actually use this and just continue and knit circular, but you're only dealing with 2 needles instead of 5. So I find this a lot less cumbersome. Some people like them, some people don't. I like them. I can do the double-pointed needles, but they're just a little fiddly, and it's taken me many years to be able to kind of coordinate myself with those. So these are my favorite. They're my one of choice for knitting socks or fingerless mitts, things that are small. And you can get the cords. They can come in all different types of lengths. Like I said, these are the smallest. They can come up into 40 some inches, depending on what you want it for. You don't need to use circular needles to knit in the round only. That's what they were created for. I actually use them even though I'm knitting a flat item. So here you can see I am knitting a flat item, but I'm using circular needles. The reason I'm using circular needles is that when I'm holding them to knit, the weight of all of the knitting is actually carried on the cord itself, not on my wrists. So it actually hangs between my hands rather than hanging off the weight of the needle itself. So I just find that for me, it's easier on my wrists to do that if I'm knitting something larger. Circular needles roughly are usually from the tip to where the cord starts is anywhere from 3 to 5 inches depending on your needle. So it's a lot easier to handle. And like I said, all the weight of your work hangs between your two hands. So that is the different types of needles. Now let's talk about how to hold them. How to hold your needles completely and your yarn completely depends on what is comfortable for you. There is no set way or right or wrong of how to hold them. For me, I am an English knitter, which means I have my yarn coming in on the right-hand side. So for me, I hold my needles like this. Just as if you were grabbing a drumstick, this is how I hold them. Some people hold their needles like this. I've tried that, and then they bring their yarn in from this side like this, and they just simply move their finger back and forth. It's very efficient, but I've never been able to coordinate that, so I tend to hold my needles like this. If you are a continental knitter, which means your yarn is coming in on the left side, again, I hold my needles the same way. Now let's look at how to hold the yarn itself. Again, that depends on what is more comfortable for you and what gives you the best tension. For me, I tend to wrap my hand like this. The yarn comes in. Most people wrap off of this finger like this. For some reason, it falls off of my finger very easily. So I tend to use this finger, which is unusual, but that's what works for me. So this is how I hold my yarn. It comes from the needle around the back of my middle finger, loops over, runs around the back of my ring finger, and then up to my index finger and over my palm. This tends to give me good tension. You don't want your knitting to be too tight or too loose. So you want something, however you choose to twist it around your fingers, you just want it to be so that you get a nice steady taut. You want it to be taut, but not tight, not too loose, because it's going to affect whether your stitches are loose or tight. The same as you would if you were crocheting. You want something that's going to smoothly pull at a steady pace off of your fingers. So for this works for me. So here is how I tend to knit. I have my right hand just holding it, like I said, like a drumstick. I have my hand wrapped like this. I grab hold of my needles. I tend to hold my needles with these two fingers and my thumb. And when I knit a stitch, I actually hold the needles together like this. I wrap it, then I come back down and I grab the needle. Like that. So I'm doing this in slow motion so you can kind of see what I'm doing. Now, if you are a continental knitter, which means the yarn is coming in on your left side, I hold my hand completely different with the yarn if I'm knitting continental. You would think I would hold it the same, but I actually don't. When I am knitting continental, I just simply wrap the yarn around my finger, and this time I do use this finger. So I don't know why I tend to knit one way with one hand and another way with the other, but I do. I wrap it around my index finger a couple times and then around my middle finger. I just kind of lay it through my middle finger. So I will knit a couple rows or a couple stitches with continental so you can see how I do that. Continental is the most efficient of knitting. It's just something I'm not real fast at. You can see you don't actually have to wrap the needle or wrap the yarn around the needle. You just are picking it up. I do tend to knit tighter if I'm knitting continental compared to knitting English style. So that is how I hold the yarn for either of my hands, but I hold my knitting needles the same for both. So now let's talk about yarn weights. Again, I do have a video, and I will put a little, if you click the little eye up in the corner, that will take you to it where it does a little bit more in depth about yarn weights. But I also had someone ask if I would do a little segment on yarn weights and how much yarn is needed for different projects. So I will try to address that question. Now I'm going to talk about different weights of yarn, what they're used for. I'm not going to address every weight of yarn because I do have a video already available about different yarn weights. And so if you want to click the little eye up in the corner, that will take you to that, and it goes into a little bit more extensively the difference between the different yarn weights. But I thought I would show you some of the common ones, what they generally are used for, and roughly how much yardage you're going to need for some of the more common made items. So we'll start with lace weight. Lace weight is the thinnest. It's what doilies are made out of. I've made some lace weight shawls out of them. Your tablecloths are made with lace weight. It can be very tedious to work with because it's very tiny. Here's a little piece of the yarn that you can see how thin this is. But it's very, very delicate. It's very lacy, as you can see. This pattern's a little bit busy. This was some yarn I dyed with some Kool-Aid a while back. So it's a very busy pattern, but it is lace weight. It's very light. Most of the time, lace weight yarn is used for doilies. It is used for lightweight shawls. You could do fingerless mitts out of it, but most of the time it's more decorative type of things that it's used for. So it's not something that is used all that common, but most of the time lace weight yarn is used for making some type of lacy item. One of the other more common weights is sport weight yarn. Sport weight yarn, you can see right here. It's a little bit heavier than fingering weight, but not by much. A lot of times they can be interchangeable. You can see the two together. You can see the two together right here. This is fingering weight. This is sport weight. Sock weight is very close as well. Sock weight's just slightly a little bit heavier than this, but not by much. They're about the same. And sport weight yarn is used for light cardigans. It could be used for lightweight sweaters. It can be used a lot of times with shawls. It's just a moderate weight yarn. Usually the size needles that you use with this tend to be between a 3 and a 5 US size. In fact, what I'm knitting here, I think I am using 4s with. I'm using a circular needle and I'm using US size 4. Now of the fingering weight, again, you can have fingering weight cardigans or sweaters. You can make a lot of shawls out of fingering weight. This is a fingering weight here. It creates a lightweight, but it's still warm. So a lot of times, like I said, fingering weight, you'll see a lot of baby items made out of fingering weight, shawls made out of fingering weight, and sweaters and pullovers made out of fingering weight as well. Of the worsted weight, this is the workhorse yarn. If you buy big box yarns from like Walmart or Kmart or Joann's, a good majority of them, probably the vast majority of them, Red Heart, all of those are going to be selling in worsted weight. So it's probably the most common. You can make anything out of these. You're more than likely not going to use them for socks. Socks are going to be the thinner yarns. But worsted weights, you can make hats, cowls, sweaters, shawls, fingerless mitts, just about anything out of this weight yarn. It is heavier than fingering weight and sport weight and sock weight. It's not a bulky yarn. Aran weight yarn is just slightly heavier than this, but not by much. On average, with worsted weight, if you were going to make a hat, you're going to need roughly around 200 yards. If you're going to use it to make a cowl, you would use more than likely between 250 and 350 yards. If you were using it for to make a sweater, on average, it is 1,100 to 1,500. Now these amounts that I'm giving you are strictly estimates because it all depends on the pattern and your size as well. So a sweater can vary by quite a bit depending on your size and the design of the sweater itself, whether it's long sleeved or short sleeved or whether it has cables. The more design there is to a pattern, the more yarn it's going to take. And if you are doing something where you're crocheting with these weights of yarn, you can increase it by about a third because crocheting does use more yarn than knitting does. So this is the worsted weight. And a fingering weight for doing a sweater, you can figure on average, and again, it's only approximate, would be between 1,500 and 2,000. Yeah, the needle size that you would usually use for a worsted weight is going to be anywhere from a 6 to an 8. This one in particular is an 8, and that is generally the average is around an 8, but I have seen a 6 or 7 used as well, but most of the time it's an 8, around an 8, because the thicker the yarn, the larger the needle size on average. Unless you're doing something that's really lacy where they call for a larger needle just so it's more open. And then we have the bulky or chunky. This is a very chunky yarn. There's also super bulky. This is almost like your rug yarn. And I'll hold this back so you can see it. This is a cowl that I made. This is one of the Cozy Up with the Stitchin' Sisters patterns. This is, I believe it's called Christina's cowl. But it is a heavy bulky yarn, and I think I knitted this with like a size US 10. So again, as the bigger the yarn, the thicker the yarn, the larger the needle on average. And bulky weights can use anywhere from usually a 9 to maybe an 11 or 12. And then the bulkier the yarn, the larger the needle size that it would go up to. Hopefully this has answered some questions regarding basic knitting, how to hold your needles, yarns, what they're used for. For the most part, there's always exceptions to the rules. There's always exceptions to all of the rules, but these are some generalizations. So hopefully you found this helpful. If you've enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up. Thanks for watching.